It was 7:15 on a Tuesday evening when Laura Barrett turned the corner on the second floor of Ridgeline Academy and stopped. The hallway was empty. The overhead lights had switched to half power. Near the far end, a man in a gray maintenance uniform sat cross-legged on the floor beside a small bench, a sheet of graph paper between his knees. He was speaking in a low, even voice to someone just behind the open supply shelf, someone Laura could not see. His left sleeve was pushed above his elbow. On the inside of his forearm, inked in dark blue and faded at the edges, was a symbol she knew by heart. A mountain peak inside a caduceus. 2 laurel branches beneath. The Barrett Fellowship crest. Her father had drawn the original on a napkin in 1994. Only 12 surgeons had ever earned the right to carry it. Laura did not move. The janitor looked up. The woman at the end of that hallway had just found something she was not prepared to explain. And the man on the floor was not expecting to be found. Stay for this one. Clark Brennan had been on the maintenance crew at Ridgeline Academy for 2 years. He worked the afternoon to evening shift, 1 o'clock to 9. He mopped the gymnasium after basketball practice, replaced ceiling tiles in the library, unclogged the third-floor restroom drains twice a month, and hauled recycling bins to the loading dock every Friday. The work was physical and repetitive, and he never complained about any of it. Before Ridgeline, Clark had been an attending trauma surgeon at Barrett Medical Center in downtown Denver. He completed his surgical residency at the University of Colorado in 2013 and was accepted into the Barrett Surgical Fellowship the following year, a program founded by Dr. Robert Barrett, one of the most respected trauma surgeons in the Mountain West. Over 4 years, Clark trained under Barrett directly. He published 9 peer-reviewed papers, 3 in the Annals of Surgery. He developed a rapid stabilization technique for blunt force thoracic trauma that the fellowship later codified as the Brennan Protocol, a sequence that reduced intraoperative mortality by 11% across Barrett Medical's 4 hospitals in its first 2 years of adoption. By 2018, when Clark completed the program, Dr. Barrett called him the best pair of hands he had ever trained. He was the 9th surgeon in 30 years to earn the fellowship crest and the youngest. Clark's wife, Ellen, died in 2022. A truck crossed the median on I-70 during a December snowstorm and hit her car head-on. She was 35. Molly was 6. In the months after Ellen's death, Clark kept working. He operated. He showed up for rounds. He did not take leave. And in late 2022, while reviewing departmental records for a quarterly quality assurance audit, he found something that did not belong. 14 surgical cases in the trauma division had been edited after the fact. Outcome data had been altered. 3 patient deaths originally recorded as intraoperative mortalities had been reclassified as complications managed. 2 cases where Clark himself had followed protocol precisely were revised to show deviation from standard approach. The edits all came from a single administrative account. Clark brought the records to Dale Rennick, who had taken over as chief of surgery in 2020 after Dr. Robert Barrett's death. Rennick told Clark the files were part of an internal coding adjustment and to leave them alone. Clark did not. 6 weeks later, a malpractice complaint was filed against Clark Brennan. It alleged that during a high-risk thoracotomy, Clark had deviated from established protocol, leading to the patient's death on the table. The only witness who testified at the medical board hearing was Dale Rennick. Clark had no legal representation. He had not sought any, still buried in the aftermath of Ellen's death. No colleagues appeared on his behalf. His medical license was revoked. He was terminated from Barrett Medical Center in the spring of 2023. He found the janitor position at Ridgeline that fall. The compensation package included a full tuition waiver for dependents of maintenance staff. That was the only reason he applied. Molly started 3rd grade in September. She was 8 now. A quiet girl who preferred numbers to words. She did her homework on the wooden bench outside the supply room every evening while her father finished his shift, her pencil working through long division with a patience that came from somewhere Clark recognized. She never asked him why he mopped floors instead of operating. She never asked about the tattoo on his arm. Laura Barrett was 34. She had taken over as CEO of Barrett Medical Group after her father's death in 2019, a regional hospital network with 4 facilities across Colorado. She sat on Ridgeline Academy's board because Barrett Medical was the school's primary sponsor, providing over $400,000 annually in scholarships and facility grants. She attended quarterly meetings, reviewed grant proposals, and walked the building once or twice a year. She had never spoken to any member of the maintenance staff, but she remembered her father's stories. She remembered him talking about the fellowship, the 12 men and women he had trained over 3 decades, the ones he said carried not just technique, but judgment. She remembered him in his home office with a glass of bourbon, describing a young surgeon whose hands were so steady the anesthesiologist joked that he did not have a resting pulse. She remembered the name, Brennan. She had never met the man. The first thing Laura did the following morning was pull the Barrett Fellowship archive from her father's office files. The records were stored in a locked cabinet behind his old desk, a desk she had never moved, still positioned at the angle he had left it 7 years ago. She opened the folder for the 2014 cohort and found Clark Brennan's application, his residency evaluations, his surgical case logs, and a handwritten note from her father stapled to the inside cover. The note said, "Watch this one." Underneath, in smaller writing, "Steadiest hands since Harold Keene. Do not lose him." Laura sat with the folder open on her lap for several minutes. She could hear her father's voice in the penmanship, the slant of his letters, the way he underlined words he meant. She opened her laptop and cross-referenced the name against Barrett Medical Center's Human Resources database. The entry was brief. Clark Brennan, attending surgeon, Division of Trauma Surgery. Start date, July 2018. Termination date, April 2023. Cause, malpractice, revocation of medical license. She opened the malpractice file. The report was 4 pages. The language was generic: procedural deviation, failure to adhere to standard of care, patient mortality. No technical details about the surgery itself. No operative notes from the procedure. No imaging reports. No anesthesia records. No testimony from any physician or nurse present in the operating room. No second opinion from an outside surgical reviewer. No deposition. No rebuttal. The entire case rested on one account of events, written by one person. The only signature on the termination recommendation belonged to Dale Rennick. Laura read the report twice. Then she laid it beside her father's fellowship folder and looked at the 2 documents side by side. The note that said "do not lose him" and the report that said he had been terminated for cause. One of them was wrong. She closed both folders, locked them in her desk, and drove to Ridgeline Academy. She found Clark in the basement mechanical room, replacing a filter in the HVAC unit. He was kneeling on the concrete floor, his hands working inside the vent housing with a focus that seemed disproportionate to the task. She stood in the doorway and waited until he noticed her. When he looked up, she did not introduce herself. Her last name was on the sponsorship plaque in the front lobby. "That tattoo on your arm," she said. "My father designed it." Clark pulled his hand from the vent housing. He looked down at his forearm. The crest was half visible beneath a smear of dust. "That was a long time ago," he said. Laura did not leave. She stood in the doorway, watching him. He held her gaze for a moment. Not hostile, not pleading, just still. The kind of stillness that came from long practice at not reacting. Then he turned back to the filter housing and resumed working. His hands moved inside the vent with the same measured precision she had noticed the night before, the same deliberate economy of motion that had made her stop in the hallway in the first place. She left without another word. But she did not go back to her car immediately. She stood in the school parking lot for a full minute, looking up at the building. The man her father had written "do not lose him" about was replacing air filters in the basement. The report that ended his career had one signature, and the person who signed it was currently the highest-ranking surgeon in her hospital. Laura spent the rest of that week in the internal records of Barrett Medical Center. She pulled the full surgical case file for the procedure cited in Clark's malpractice report. The patient was a 58-year-old male admitted for emergency thoracic repair after a construction site fall. The operating room log listed Clark as the attending surgeon, with 2 residents and a circulating nurse. The original outcome had been recorded as an intraoperative mortality, a known risk for the procedure, consistent with the patient's age and injury severity. But 6 weeks after the surgery, the file had been edited. The timestamp on the revision was unambiguous, entered at 9:47 on a Wednesday evening, long after regular documentation hours. Someone had accessed the electronic health record system and changed the procedural notes. The original narrative read, "Standard thoracotomy approach. No deviation from protocol." Intraoperative mortality consistent with patient presentation and injury severity. The revised version read, deviation from standard approach. Attending failed to follow established guidelines. Outcome attributable to procedural error. Laura checked the system's access permissions. Barrett Medical's surgical record platform restricted editing privileges to department-level administrators. In the Division of Trauma Surgery, one account had administrative edit access. It belonged to Dale Rennick. Laura printed the audit trail, original entry, revised entry, timestamp, and account ID, and locked the pages in her desk drawer. She sat at her desk for a long time after that, staring at the locked drawer. Then she picked up her keys and drove to Ridgeline. She found Clark stacking chairs in the cafeteria after a parents' evening. The room was empty except for him and the rows of folding chairs. Laura told him what she had found, the timestamp, the edit, the access log, the revision that turned a clean surgical record into a malpractice case. She laid it out the way she would have presented it to a board, precise, sequential, without editorializing. Clark set the last chair on the stack. He straightened it until it was perfectly aligned with the one beneath. Then he stood with his hands at his sides. "I know what happened," he said. "I was there." "Then why didn't you fight it?" Clark looked at her, not with anger, not with self-pity, but with the flat exhaustion of a man who had answered that question 1,000 times in his own head. "I had a 6-year-old who just lost her mother," he said. "I didn't have a fight left in me." He picked up his mop bucket and wheeled it toward the door. Laura stood among the stacked chairs and pulled up Clark's publication record on her phone. 9 papers, 3 in the Annals of Surgery, 2 cited over 200 times. The Brennan Protocol, standard across 4 hospitals. She put her phone away and left through the side door. On Monday morning, a system notification appeared on Laura's internal dashboard at Barrett Medical. The IT security team flagged it during a routine audit log review. Her CEO-level credentials had been used to open Clark Brennan's sealed personnel file, his terminated employee records, and the surgical case log from the malpractice citation. Each access event was time-stamped, logged, and automatically forwarded to the head of the relevant clinical division. In the Division of Trauma Surgery, that was Dale Rennick. By Wednesday, Rennick called Laura directly. His tone was measured and professional. He said he was reaching out about a staffing matter at Ridgeline Academy, not Barrett Medical. He mentioned that the school's advisory board had been discussing operational efficiency in the facilities department. He suggested 2 afternoon maintenance positions could be consolidated without affecting service quality. He did not mention Clark Brennan by name. He framed it as routine fiscal planning. He asked Laura if she had any concerns about the proposal. Laura said she would review the recommendation and get back to him. She kept her voice even. She did not tell him that his call had answered a question she had been circling for days, whether the man who had signed Clark's termination was still actively invested in keeping him down, or whether the malpractice case had been a one-time act of self-preservation that Rennick had moved past. The call made it clear. Rennick had not moved past anything. He was still watching the perimeter. On Thursday, Clark received a printed memo from his supervisor at the school. The advisory board had recommended a staffing review in the maintenance department. 2 afternoon positions were being considered for elimination. Clark's name was on the list. The stated reason was budget reallocation due to shifting enrollment patterns. Clark read the memo in the supply room. He folded it once, put it in his back pocket, and finished his shift. He picked up Molly from the bench in the hallway at 9 and drove home without mentioning it. Laura sat in her office on the 14th floor of Barrett Medical's downtown tower that evening. She had not told Rennick she was looking into Clark's file. She had not mentioned Clark's name to anyone. The only path from her file access to Rennick's phone call ran through the system audit log. And the only reason a chief of surgery would respond to a CEO reviewing a 3-year-old janitor's sealed file by reaching across to a school advisory board to threaten that janitor's last remaining job was if the file still contained something worth burying. Rennick's call was not about maintenance staffing. It was the reaction of a man who had built a careful architecture of lies and felt someone lean against the wall. He was testing whether the structure would hold, and by calling, he had told Laura exactly where the weight-bearing joints were. The call was confirmation. Over the next 2 weeks, Laura found reasons to visit Ridgeline Academy that had nothing to do with Clark Brennan. She told the front office she was preparing the annual sponsorship review, a report she normally completed from her desk using submitted documents. She toured classrooms. She reviewed the science lab renovations. She walked the hallways with a clipboard and a purpose that only she understood. She watched Clark repair a burst pipe in the basement utility corridor on a Tuesday afternoon. He shut the valve, cleared the standing water with a shop vacuum, cut the damaged section of copper with a tube cutter, measured the replacement, deburred the ends, applied flux, and soldered the joint with a propane torch, all in under 20 minutes. His hands never hesitated. Every motion was deliberate, sequenced, and clean. She had seen enough surgeons work through the observation gallery at Barrett Medical to recognize the discipline in his movements. That kind of steadiness was not learned on a maintenance crew. It was the remnant of something else entirely. She watched him replace a broken window latch in the second-floor science lab without being asked. She watched him carry a 4-drawer filing cabinet up 2 flights of stairs for the front office administrator and refuse help by simply picking it up and walking. He moved through the building the way he had probably once moved through an operating room, aware of every surface, every angle, every point of failure. She also pulled the complete transcript of Clark's malpractice hearing from Barrett Medical's legal archive. It took 3 days to get clearance. The hospital's general counsel asked why the CEO was personally reviewing a closed case. Laura told him she was auditing quality assurance procedures across all clinical divisions. He approved the request. The transcript confirmed what the 4-page report had implied. No independent witness testimony had been presented. No second surgeon reviewed the case. No outside expert was consulted. Clark had appeared without counsel and declined to make a statement in his own defense. Rennick had testified for 40 minutes, describing the surgery, the deviation, and the outcome in language detailed enough to sound authoritative but vague enough to resist the cross-examination that never came. The panel deliberated for less than 2 hours. The entire proceeding read less like a hearing and more like a formality, the conclusion drafted before the testimony began. That same week, Rennick sent a formal letter to the Ridgeline Academy Board of Directors recommending the elimination of 2 maintenance positions effective the following quarter. The letter cited rising operational costs and declining enrollment projections. Neither claim was accurate. Enrollment had increased 11% over 3 years, and maintenance costs were flat since 2024. But the letter carried the weight of an advisory board member representing Barrett Medical, the school's largest sponsor. No one on the Ridgeline board would question it. Clark saw the direction. He updated his resume for the first time in 3 years and started looking at custodial openings across the Denver metro area. He did not tell Laura. They had spoken 4 times. He was not going to make it 5 by asking a CEO to save his janitor job. Laura understood the full architecture now. Rennick controlled the hospital, where Clark's career had ended. He sat on the advisory board of the school, where Clark's last foothold depended on a position Rennick was actively trying to eliminate. The pressure came from both directions, and it was designed to be invisible to anyone not looking. She also understood that timestamps and access logs were not enough to take apart what Rennick had built. She needed someone who had been in the operating room, someone who had seen what actually happened during the surgery and could speak to it under oath. What she found next was not in a database. It was in a person who had been quiet for 3 years and who had kept a copy of the truth in the bottom drawer of her desk. Laura found Janet Crew on a Wednesday afternoon in the surgical nursing office on the 4th floor of Barrett Medical Center. Janet was 58 years old. She had worked at the hospital for 26 years, longer than any other active nurse on staff. She had scrubbed in with Clark Brennan on more than 200 trauma cases during his 5 years as an attending surgeon. She was the most senior and most experienced surgical nurse in the building. Laura closed the office door. She sat across from Janet and laid out everything. The fellowship record with her father's handwritten note, the malpractice file with a single signature, the timestamp showing the surgical log had been edited 6 weeks after the procedure, the access trail pointing to Rennick's administrative account, and the letter to the Ridgeline board designed to push Clark out of his last remaining position. Janet listened without interrupting. Her hands were folded on the desk. When Laura finished, Janet opened the bottom drawer of her desk, pulled out a black USB flash drive, and set it on the surface between them. "I copied the surgical logs before they were changed," Janet said. "The originals. All 14 cases." Janet explained that she had watched Rennick begin editing files in late 2022, 3 weeks after Clark confronted him about the data discrepancies. She recognized what was happening. That same night, she printed the original case logs and saved digital copies to her personal drive. She had intended to report it to hospital administration, but Rennick controlled annual performance evaluations for the entire nursing staff in the trauma division. He approved schedules, shift assignments, and contract renewals. Speaking up meant losing her position. At 55, with a mortgage and no savings beyond her hospital pension, she could not take that risk. She had been quiet for 3 years. The flash drive had stayed in the drawer the entire time, underneath a box of surgical gloves, behind a stack of supply order forms. Janet said she checked it once a year to make sure the files still opened. They always did. Laura plugged it into her laptop. The files opened in a spreadsheet, surgical case logs sorted by date, patient ID, procedure type, and outcome. She placed them side by side with the current records in Barrett Medical's electronic system. The differences were not subtle. 14 cases had been altered. 3 intraoperative mortalities had been reclassified as complications managed successfully. 2 cases in which Clark followed protocol exactly as documented were rewritten to show deviation from standard approach, the same language that appeared word for word in his malpractice report. The remaining 9 involved smaller adjustments. Complication rates lowered, recovery timelines shortened, readmission figures suppressed, all designed to make the division's surgical statistics look stronger than they were. The pattern was systematic. It was not a clerical error. It was a campaign. Janet leaned forward and pointed to 2 specific entries on the screen. "These are the ones they used against him," she said. "He did everything right in both procedures. I was in the room for both of them. I prepped the trays. I handed him the instruments. I watched his hands the entire time." She paused. "In 26 years, I never saw a surgeon work cleaner than Clark Brennan. Not once." Laura asked if Janet would testify before the Barrett Medical Board of Directors. Janet looked at the flash drive, then at the closed office door, then back at Laura. She was quiet for a long time. "If my position is protected," she said. "In writing." Laura drafted the guarantee that afternoon on Barrett Medical Group letterhead. She signed it personally as CEO and hand-delivered it to Janet before end of day. The evidence package was complete. Original surgical logs preserved before alteration. System audit trail identifying Rennick's administrative account as the sole source of all 14 revisions. A malpractice hearing conducted without independent witnesses, expert review, or legal counsel for the accused. And a 26-year senior surgical nurse willing to testify under oath that the accused had done nothing wrong. Laura scheduled a board meeting at Barrett Medical Center for the following Tuesday. The official agenda read, "Internal Audit of Quality Assurance Procedures, Division of Trauma Surgery." She notified all 7 board members and copied Dale Rennick as division chief, per standard protocol. Rennick arrived at 9:15 in a pressed white coat. He carried a leather portfolio and a cup of coffee from the physician's lounge. He sat at the far end of the conference table, opened his laptop, and arranged his papers in a neat stack. He looked like a man who had sat through 100 reviews and expected to sit through 100 more. Laura began without preamble. She projected the official surgical case log, the version currently in Barrett Medical's system, on the wall screen. Then she projected Janet Crew's originals beside it, side by side, in matching columns. She walked the board through each of the 14 altered cases. Date, patient ID, procedure, original recorded outcome, revised outcome, timestamp of the revision, the administrative account that made the edit. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She read the data the way her father had taught her to read surgical reports, one line at a time, letting the facts carry the weight they already carried. Janet Crew entered the room at 9:32. She had requested to present in person rather than submit a written statement. She stood at the front of the table with her hands at her sides and walked through the 2 cases used against Clark Brennan. She described the procedures from memory, the initial incision, the sequence of clamping and retraction, the instruments she handed Clark at each stage, the moment the first patient coded, and the resuscitation protocol Clark initiated within 4 seconds. She confirmed that Clark followed protocol in both cases. She confirmed that the outcomes were consistent with known surgical risk given the patient's conditions. She confirmed that the records had been changed after the fact, and that she had preserved the originals on the night the changes were made. Rennick interrupted twice. He said the offline copies were not verified through the hospital's chain of custody procedures and could not be treated as authoritative. He said Janet Crew had a long-standing professional relationship with Clark Brennan and that her testimony reflected personal bias. He did not provide an alternative explanation for the 14 altered records. He did not explain why his administrative account was the only one with edit access. He did not address the timestamps. Laura pulled up the final exhibit, the system audit trail from Barrett Medical's electronic health record platform. The platform logged every edit by user account, timestamp, and IP address. The 14 revisions were made over a 3-week period in late 2022, all from the same account, all from the same terminal in the chief of surgery's office. The account belonged to Dale Rennick. The board voted at 10:47, 7-1. Rennick was suspended from all clinical and administrative duties effective immediately, pending a full investigation. The complete evidence package, original logs, audit trail, hearing transcript, Janet Crew's testimony, was referred to the Colorado Medical Board. Rennick closed his laptop. He placed it in his portfolio. He picked up his coffee cup, still half full, untouched since the presentation began, and set it back down. He removed his white coat from the back of his chair, folded it over his arm with the name embroidered on the breast facing inward, and left the conference room without speaking. The door closed behind him with a soft click. No one at the table said anything for several seconds after he was gone. Laura sat in the empty conference room for several minutes after the last board member left. The projector was still on, throwing a blue rectangle of light across the far wall. She closed her laptop and sat with her hands flat on the table. She thought about her father's handwriting, the slant of the letters, the underlined words. She thought about the notes stapled to the inside of a folder that had been locked in a cabinet for 7 years. Do not lose him. She put the folder in her bag and drove to Ridgeline Academy. She found Clark in the east stairwell between the first and second floors, replacing a loose handrail bolt. His toolbox was open on the step below him. A strip of afternoon light fell through the narrow window above the landing and caught the dust in the air between them. Laura told him what had happened that morning. The presentation, the evidence laid out line by line, the vote, the suspension, the referral. She told him the Colorado Medical Board would formally reopen his malpractice case. Clark set the wrench down on the step beside him. He straightened up slowly and looked at Laura for a long time. His hands were still. Then he nodded once. "Why did you do all of this?" he said. "My father would have," Laura said. Clark picked up the wrench. He turned it over in his hand, then placed it in the toolbox and closed the lid. "The license review could take 6 months," he said. "Maybe longer." "I know. I'm still a janitor until then." Laura did not respond to that. She stood on the landing below him, one hand resting on the railing he had just tightened. The stairwell was quiet. The building made its usual settling sounds. A door closing somewhere on the first floor, the boiler humming in the basement, the tick of warm water moving through old pipes. Neither of them spoke. The light through the window shifted, lengthening across the concrete steps. Laura left first. She went down the stairs and through the fire door at the bottom. The heavy door swung shut behind her with a sound that echoed up the concrete shaft and faded. Clark stood on the landing for another minute, looking at the window, at the railing under his hand, at the calluses on his palms that had replaced the ones he used to get from surgical instruments. Then he picked up his toolbox and went back to work. 3 weeks later, Laura called Clark. It was a Saturday morning. She offered him a consulting position at Barrett Medical, a non-clinical advisory role in the trauma division, helping develop updated surgical protocols while his license reinstatement was pending. Clark was quiet on the line for a moment. Then he thanked her. Then he said no. He told her he was not ready to walk back into that building. Not yet. Laura said the offer would stay open. She did not push. Neither of them brought it up again. 6 weeks after the board vote, Clark received a letter from the Colorado Medical Board. He was sitting on the metal folding chair in the supply room when his supervisor handed him the envelope without comment. Clark turned it over in his hands before opening it. He read the single page twice. The malpractice charge had been formally vacated. His medical license was eligible for reinstatement pending completion of a standard review, continuing education verification, peer references, and a procedural interview. The letter estimated 4 to 6 months. Clark set the letter face down on his knee. He sat in the supply room for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed above him. He looked at the inside of his left forearm. The tattoo was 15 years old now. The ink had softened. The mountain peak had lost its sharpest edges. The laurel branches had blurred into one another. But the shape was still there, the same shape Ellen had traced with her finger on their first date and asked what it meant, the same shape Molly had pointed to when she was 4 and asked if it was a drawing of a mountain. That evening, driving home, Molly sat in the back seat with her math workbook on her lap. She looked up at the rearview mirror. "Dad, how come that lady keeps coming to school?" Clark glanced at her reflection. "She's someone who pays attention," he said. Molly considered that for a few seconds, her pencil still between her fingers. Then she went back to her workbook. Clark watched the road. The mountains west of Denver were dark against the last edge of daylight. He looked at the rearview mirror again, at Molly, at her pencil, at the steady focus on her face, and something in his chest loosened, just slightly, for the first time in a long time. The next afternoon, Laura came to the school. It was a Thursday. Clark was waiting for her outside the supply room. The first time he had ever waited for her anywhere. He was standing in the hallway with the letter in his hand. When Laura reached him, he held it out without saying anything. She took the letter and read it standing up, her back against the hallway wall. When she finished, she folded it along its original creases and handed it back. Their hands were closed for a moment, but did not touch. The hallway was empty. The overhead lights were at half power, the same as they had been the first night. Laura looked at the bench where Molly usually sat. The math workbook was there, closed, stacked neatly on top of a blue pencil case. Clark followed her gaze. Neither of them said anything. The building was quiet around them. Somewhere below, the boilers cycled on, and the pipes ticked softly in the walls. 4 months later, Clark Brennan walked through the main entrance of Barrett Medical Center at 6:15 on a Monday morning. He wore a white coat for the first time in nearly 3 years. His hospital badge read, Attending Surgeon, Division of Trauma Surgery. He carried a thermos of coffee and a pair of surgical loops in a hard case. The security guard at the front desk did not recognize him. The nurse at the 4th floor station did. She set down her chart and stood up when he came through the double doors. Janet Cruz's nameplate now read, Nursing Director, Division of Trauma Surgery. Laura had signed the appointment herself. Janet still kept the flash drive in the bottom drawer of her desk. She said she would keep it there until she retired. Clark operated 3 mornings a week. His hands had not changed. The residents who scrubbed in with him said the same thing the anesthesiologist had always said, that his pulse did not seem to exist. He did not talk about the 2 years he had been away. He did not talk about Rennick. When a second-year resident asked where he had been, Clark said he had been working and left it at that. In the afternoons, Clark drove across town to Ridgeline Academy. He was no longer on the maintenance staff. Laura had established an after-school enrichment program through Barrett Medical's Community Education Fund, and Clark taught the mathematics section. He stood at the whiteboard in room 214 3 days a week and walked 8- and 9-year-olds through long division, fractions, and the first steps of algebra. He used graph paper. He used the same patient, methodical voice he had always used. The students did not know he was a surgeon. They knew him as the man who had mopped the hallways the year before. Molly sat in the front row. Her workbook was always finished before he started. She never raised her hand during class. She never needed to. Dale Rennick's medical license was permanently revoked by the Colorado Medical Board following a 5-month investigation. 14 counts of falsifying surgical outcome data. 1 count of filing a fraudulent malpractice complaint against a licensed physician. Clark was not present at the hearing. He did not submit a statement. He did not need to. On a Friday afternoon in late October, Laura came to Ridgeline Academy at 4:30. The after-school session was ending. She walked up the stairs to the 2nd floor and stopped outside the open door of room 214. Clark was at the whiteboard, erasing a row of fractions with the side of his hand. Molly was at the front desk, zipping her backpack. 2 other students were pulling on their jackets near the windows. Laura leaned against the doorframe. It was the same position, the same angle, the same hallway, the same light shifting toward evening, where she had first seen Clark on the floor with the graph paper and the tattoo on his arm. She did not say anything. Clark turned from the board. He was holding a blue dry erase marker in his right hand. He saw her and did not look surprised. He had stopped being surprised by her a long time ago. Molly finished with her backpack, walked to the door, and stopped in front of Laura. Laura bent down and said something close to her ear, something quiet, just between them. Molly nodded, adjusted her straps, and walked down the hallway toward the late bus. Clark stood at the whiteboard. The afternoon light came through the tall windows and lay flat across the rows of small desks. Laura was still in the doorframe. He looked at her, and she looked back, and something in the room shifted, not with any sound or gesture, not with anything either of them said, but in the way a space changes when two people stop pretending they're standing in it by accident. He picked up the marker. The next problem was already on the board.